Let's discuss the 2020 Rolex releases. The news has broken. Most of us know what the watches are at this point, so we're not going to run round those details, but instead step back and question why these pieces were approached the way they were. The 41mm Submariner, the Stella Dial Oyster Perpetual, and the rubber strap integrated Skydwellers. What has the general reaction been with these pieces? Similar to most years, there's a bit of interest, but not much excitement. Why is that? Well, primarily because we probably won't be able to get our hands on most of these pieces for a very long time, and that does sting. We've got to admit it. Now we know, before even starting this discussion, it's very important to highlight that this was by no means a time for them to bring out new models. The Submariner is the main watch under the spotlight, and it received a facelift, a much-deserved facelift that many of us were expecting. The method of how it was done was surprising. Some were very close, with ideas of the watch being increased to 42mm, to be brought out in rose gold, in two-tone, to have different dial options, different bezels. But this is where I'd like to use the phrase 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because we did see much improvement. We are going to talk about the architecture of the watch in a moment. The watch's size was increased, its presence was increased ever so slightly, it received an entirely new movement. Those are the forward steps. The step backwards is that we lost the Hulk Submariner and gained the Cermet. We lost the Smurf Submariner and gained the Viagra, whatever you want to call it. The steel watches, especially this new ceramic Kermit, it doesn't look exciting. Similar to the blue bezel, the now new white gold variant, does it have as much punch as the earlier generations? And then we must also realize that these renders that we're looking at on the screen are not accurate portrayals of the actual colors that we will be seeing. What made the Hulk Submariner so charming was that beautiful emerald dial, how it worked then with the green bezel. The fact that that is now lost and has been replaced instead with just the generic black dial and green bezel insert, visually the watch doesn't have the punch it used to. Let's dig into this deeper. Why did they get rid of the Hulk Submariner? It was due for retirement at this point. I think most of us can agree with that. And maybe the introduction of this tamer version was done in a way to try and avert the grey market resellers. The biggest irony of all is that the Hulk Submariner is now retailing for 20k plus online, which is just ridiculous. So that didn't work. Was this then an approach to try and neutralize the overall impression of this holier-than-thou Submariner in the line? Possibly. The only vibrant model in the line is the two-tone blue Submariner, which is a watch that's been around for a very long time and surprisingly still here. It's obviously a piece that is still very much admired and is integral to the Submariner DNA. Let's talk about the size increase. It is a contentious point in a way because most of us will agree that the 40mm size met this beautiful golden ratio proportion. The size of this watch has never been increased. Ever since the late 50s, early 60s, it's always remained in that ballpark of 40mm. Okay, let's take a step back to the 2010s, where we saw the introduction of the first super case. What was its intention? Initially, I believed it to be an engineering move. In a way, the watch with bigger lugs allows for it to withstand much more polishing over its lifetime, therefore increasing its longevity. That's practical. It does make sense. What the increase of the lug size did was allowed for the watch to have more visual presence on the wrist. Visually it looks larger while still remaining the golden 40mm in size. Ever since the super case has been around, we've been complaining that it's too squared off and should be tapered ever so much. So they were stuck with a conundrum here. And the way they addressed it was actually very well done. Increase the size by 1mm. In a sense, then visually increases the overall size of the watch and its presence, that then gives you the opportunity to taper in the lugs so that the overall size is not compromised. The watch still has a lot of presence, but now retains a more traditional look of what the tapered lug Submariner was always about. Both sides of the coin, we can see why this was done. As a result, we have a Submariner that now looks slightly bigger, but does hold the traits of those original 5-digit subs. What gave Rolex the confidence to do this? That's a simple question to answer. Back in the 2010s, the introduction of the super case was the first effort. Then we saw the 44mm Deep Sea. Later on, we saw the 42mm Explorer 2, and most recently, the 43mm Skydweller. These incremental size increases has been a testing platform for Rolex to understand just how they can play with proportion and presence. Most of us praised the 43mm Skydweller by how the lugs tapered and how the bracelet worked in relation to the size of the watch. So in this case, they have taken what they've learned from the Skydweller and made it practical. The new caliber is a welcome improvement, and there's no denying that when we look at the tuxedo black date and no date variants, they look extremely good. Very subtle to the untrained eye. I think many might be fooled by this change. Then it's now asking the question of the sizes. Rolex as a brand has been quite conservative with their sizes in the past, and many have been talking about the idea that watches and their presence will decrease over time, that size increases were a thing of the past. And there is something quite irksome thinking that the Submariner is now 41mm. This new generation of the watch has been made bigger. The purists are going to be very angry about this, for sure. Was it a wise move? Only time will tell. The resulting watch is what we have wanted to see for a long time, virtually 10 years at this point, and they have done an excellent job with it. As far as facelifts go, this was done very tastefully. The only issue is this addition of colors or lack of addition. How could they have jazzed it up a little bit? This is where we could factor in my prediction. Imagine the Hulk Submariner does leave the line, but then instead of replacing it the way they have, bring out a royal blue dial, blue bezel, all the trimmings, tapered down case, new movement, everything, and have that watch be the worthy successor of the Hulk Submariner in the line when it comes to looking at the stainless steel only Submariner. That would have been a more impactful way of introducing this new Submariner line with a bit more punch than what we actually got. The community seems a lot more excited looking at the Oyster Perpetuals that have been introduced. There are pros and cons with this. The first point that has to be raised is why did they remove the 39 variant and introduce a 41mm size instead? These watches are going to look huge on the wrist. The 39mm looked large as it is. In 41, they are going to be ever present. And it begs the question, it shows that the conservativeness of Rolex's sizing with a lot of these larger sized watches has been thrown out of the window in a sense. Who were these Perpetuals created for? They seem to be banking on and finding inspirations from the styles of the 30 dial variants of day dates that have become ever popular and present. We've seen the auction houses full of stone dial variants. On the grey market they are very popular. So maybe this was Rolex's way of segueing this approach into their line. The issue is these colours are so bright that they might not appeal to the majority. The way the double batons have been used at the quarters, is it as clean and symmetrical as it could be? Is that a style that many people like? Traditionally, the batons should run seamlessly around the dial, without the need of doubling up at the quarters. They do allow the eye to break up the positioning on the dial, but are they as appealing? Of all the pieces that have been released, Submariners, Skydwellers, these Oyster Perpetuals, the one that speaks to me is the silver dial with the gold accents. A very nice complementary nature between the parts. I just wish that they weren't double batons at the quarters. It's a style and an aesthetic that should fit a certain variant, not all of them. And it seems like the Oyster Perpetual has now been phased in with these double batons everywhere. I think this layout might turn away many eager customers. This section was added a few days after the recording. With a bit more hindsight, some brilliant points about these Oyster Perpetuals have been made, and it needs to be mentioned. I guess the first part, when I was looking at these watches, it was more of a knee-jerk reaction, not so much a deeper thought. The issue is when you consider what Rolex is as a conservative brand, seeing this launch of these exuberant pieces does leave you questioning a few things. As mentioned by a few channels, and I want to plug Pete from Not So Obvious Watches, I'll put a link to his video in the corner of the screen now. He mentions that these watches might just be the true release from Rolex. And when we look at this area, not from an enthusiast's point of view, but from a general consumer's point of view, don't you think that if you saw these pieces in the shop window, you would stop and have a good look at them? The nature of these dials, what they represent, reminded me of a similar release from a different brand. Remember the Apple iPhone 5C? This feels exactly the same as that. Now granted, we're not talking about disposable consumerism here. Watches are made to last a lifetime. But the whole appeal and the approach of color as this expressive element that will attract more people, that adds a new dynamic to the visage of the Rolex name. On top of that, affordability, a much more accessible price point, can bring more people into the hobby. Whether we're looking at different ages, different genders, there are so many factors at play here. And after seeing live photos of these now, the coral red, the mustard yellow, and the turquoise blue. They're very attractive for that reason. If you think about owning a Rolex in your collection, they're not the ones that come to mind first. But because of these oversaturated, exuberant dials, they add a different dynamic completely. The Skydweller on rubber. Why was this done? No idea. We can assume maybe they were doing this to make more sales. Maybe the Skydweller hasn't been selling as well as they wanted it to. Maybe to bring the overall price down of the watch, they have removed the solid gold bracelet to make it more attainable. There is a great use of colors here. Black and gold is always appealing. But I look at this watch and I see compromise. And I'll explain this by asking you all the question, what would happen if Rolex decided to remove the President bracelet from the day date and instead put a rubber strap on the watch? How would you feel? Does that not compromise the overall image of the watch? I think it would. The Skydweller has this amazing inspiration behind it. I'll link you to the video that I made all about its background. But seeing this watch the way it is, it feels like a watch that Rolex doesn't really understand. It's kind of like the red-headed stepchild in the family. What can we expect down the line now after these releases? Well, we know that the sports model's out of the question. You'll be very lucky to find the new Submariners on the shelves. You'll be lucky to place an order for one. Whether or not the green bezel Submariner is going to be popular remains to be seen. Visually, it doesn't look anywhere near as elegant as the Hulk Submariner was. We can expect that the GMTs are going to go through the same overhaul in the next year or so, all getting the same cases and proportions. It's basically inevitable. The Submariner case is very much the foundation that is then built upon. The reactions have been fairly lukewarm with these releases because nothing new was brought out. Everything was upgraded and facelifted. That's fine. There wasn't a need for them to make any improvements. I hate to use the B word, but a lot of these feel kind of boring. What have been your thoughts on this release? What does it spell for the future of the new lines? In the past, there have been more exciting releases, let's be honest. But owing to what's been going on in the world, it's inevitable that this was a gradual evolution, not a time to bring out something new. The hot topic and talking point, as far as the new Submariners go, the integration was excellent. Increasing the size to bring down the overall width of the lugs allowed for it to keep its visual presence. But frankly, the rest of these have been pretty boring, and I fear that a lot more models in the sports and professional line will be removed in the coming months. But as is always the case, every year, we go through the time and effort to bring out ideas, predictions and thoughts about how the brand could reintegrate and recreate their lines. And so often, we are left on the wayside, feeling neutral.